In the summer of 1298, the fields of Scotland became the stage for one of the most dramatic clashes of the Wars of Independence. William Wallace, the guardian of a defiant nation, led his outnumbered forces against the vast and disciplined army of England's King Edward I, the feared Hammer of the Scots. Fresh from his triumph at Stirling Bridge, Wallace now faced a test unlike any before. What unfolded at Falkirk was not just a battle of men and steel, but of strategy, courage, and the desperate struggle of a people fighting for their very survival. The battle followed a cycle of hope and despair. Just 10 months earlier, Wallace and Andrew Moray had stunned the medieval world with their victory at Stirling Bridge, 1297, routing a much larger English army and giving Scotland a brief taste of independence. But Falkirk would brutally reverse those fortunes. Wallace's forces fought bravely, but Edward's combination of cavalry and longbowmen exploited the weaknesses in the Scottish defensive formations, crushing the rebellion's military core. Yet Falkirk was not the end. Though Wallace resigned his guardianship after the battle, his legend only grew stronger in defeat. Falkirk also set the stage for Robert the Bruce's eventual rise and Scotland's ultimate triumph at Bannockburn in 1314. To understand Falkirk, we must step back into the political turmoil of late 13th century Scotland. The Scottish kingdom entered crisis in March 1286 with the sudden death of King Alexander III. His fatal fall from a horse left Scotland without a direct adult heir. The crown passed to his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. But her death in 1290, during a voyage to Scotland, plunged the realm into chaos. The succession crisis left Scotland divided among competing claimants. The most prominent were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the grandfather of the later king. With no internal consensus, the Scottish nobility invited Edward I of England to arbitrate. Edward was more than a mediator, he was a conqueror in waiting. Known as the Hammer of the Scots, and already a veteran of wars in Wales and France, Edward saw an opportunity to extend his overlordship north of the border. He demanded that any claimant to the Scottish throne recognize him as overlord before judgment could be given. The choice fell on John Balliol, crowned in 1292, but Edward treated Balliol as a vassal rather than a sovereign king. Within a few short years, Balliol and the Scottish nobles resisted, entering into a secret treaty with France, the beginning of the so-called Auld Alliance. Edward responded with fury. In 1296, he launched a devastating campaign into Scotland. Berwick was sacked in one of the bloodiest massacres of the medieval British Isles. Dunbar fell, and Balliol was stripped of his crown, sent into exile as the Tomb Tabard, the empty coat. Scotland had been conquered, or so Edward thought. Into this vacuum of leadership stepped William Wallace, a minor knight whose name would become immortal. In 1297, Wallace joined forces with Andrew Moray, a northern nobleman also leading resistance. Together, they struck at English garrisons across the country, their most spectacular victory coming at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, September 1297. At Stirling, Wallace and Moray lured a much larger English force into a bottleneck crossing the River Forth. The result was a massacre. Hundreds of English knights and infantrymen were cut down, and Scotland was briefly liberated. The victory made Wallace guardian of Scotland in the name of the absent John Balliol. But Moray's death from wounds left Wallace largely isolated in leadership. For Edward I, Stirling was an outrage. The English king had been campaigning in France, but he returned with determination to crush the Scots once and for all. By early 1298, he had assembled a massive army, bringing together knights, infantry, Welsh longbowmen, and a logistical train designed to grind Scotland into submission. Wallace, meanwhile, lacked the resources of Edward. His army was composed mainly of common infantry, with a small and often unreliable cavalry contingent provided by the Scottish nobles. His main tactical innovation was the use of schiltrons, dense pike formations of spearmen that could withstand cavalry charges. But as events would show, the schiltron could not withstand everything. By the spring of 1298, Edward I had returned from France and was determined to erase the humiliation of Stirling Bridge. His war machine was vast and professional by medieval standards. he summoned not only the knights and infantry of England, but also archers from Wales and mercenaries from abroad. Chroniclers estimate his army at 15,000 to 20,000 strong, one of the largest invasion forces England ever sent into Scotland. But the sheer size of the army also created problems. Feeding such a mass of men and horses through the rough terrain of Scotland was a logistical nightmare. Edward's supply fleet, meant to provision the army via the coast, was delayed and disrupted. Hunger soon gnawed at the invading host and discipline began to break down. Desertions mounted. Still, Edward pressed forward. His determination to personally lead the campaign showed both his pride and his recognition that Scotland would not be subdued without his direct presence. Wallace, now Guardian of Scotland, understood his army could not match Edward's force in a pitched open-field battle. His strategy was one of attrition and harassment, the classic tactic of a weaker side. Scottish forces burned crops, drove off livestock, and used the rough terrain to harass the invaders. Wallace hoped famine would do the work that Scottish spears could not. Indeed, for a time his plan worked. Edward's army, starved and frustrated, began to retreat southward in search of supplies. But Wallace made a fateful miscalculation. As Edward's host withdrew, Wallace believed he had an opportunity to strike. Gathering his forces, he moved to shadow the English and intercept them near the town of Falkirk in Stirlingshire. Edward's host at Falkirk was a formidable blend of medieval arms, cavalry, knights and men-at-arms, the backbone of the English army. Heavy cavalry armoured in mail and mounted on destriers remained the shock force of medieval Europe. At Falkirk, Edward had thousands of knights drawn from England's nobility. Infantry, English foot soldiers armed with spears, swords and shields, provided the bulk of the manpower. Welsh longbowmen, perhaps the decisive element. Skilled in rapid fire, the longbowmen could unleash a storm of arrows that no schiltron could withstand forever. Their presence would mark Falkirk as a turning point in medieval tactics. Numbers. Estimates vary, but most historians agree Edward commanded between 15,000 and 18,000 men, including 2,500 to 3,000 knights. Edward himself commanded with his usual intensity, despite suffering from illness during the campaign. Chroniclers suggest he was even carried on a litter at times, but refused to relinquish leadership. Wallace's army was far smaller and far less diverse in its composition. Infantry, spearmen, schiltrons, the core of Wallace's force. Organized into huge circular or hedgehog formations, the schiltron bristled with long spears, designed to repel cavalry charges. Each man relied on the shield of his comrade, creating a wall of defense. Cavalry, a major weakness. The Scottish nobles, often divided in loyalty, provided only a few hundred horsemen. Many abandoned Wallace before the battle began, leaving him without mobile support. Archers, few in number and poorly equipped compared to Edward's Welsh bowmen. Numbers. Wallace may have had 8,000 to 10,000 infantry and a few hundred cavalry at best. Wallace himself commanded with passion and charisma, but he lacked the resources and noble support to field an army capable of matching Edward's on open ground. His strength was in defensive tactics, not maneuver warfare. Wallace chose ground near Falkirk that he believed would neutralize Edward's cavalry. He arrayed his infantry in 4 massive schiltrons, each resembling a hedgehog of spears. Gaps between the schiltrons were filled with archers, while what little cavalry he had was placed on the flanks. The ground was marshy in places, offering some protection against mounted charges. Wallace believed that, as at Stirling Bridge, disciplined formations could blunt English strength. But unlike Stirling, there was no river bottleneck. Falkirk was to be fought on open ground, and here, Edward's numbers, longbowmen, and cavalry could operate freely. On the night before 22nd July 1298, both armies prepared for confrontation. For the Scots there was resolve but also anxiety. Many nobles were reluctant and unity was fragile. For Edward's men, hunger and fatigue weighed heavily, yet the prospect of finally crushing Wallace's rebellion spurred them on. Chroniclers describe Edward rising before dawn to hear mass and then rallying his men. Despite his illness and exhaustion, his determination to lead personally inspired confidence. Wallace, for his part, is said to have spoken of Scotland's freedom and the need to stand as one against the invader. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest and most consequential battles of the First War of Scottish Independence. As dawn broke over the fields near Falkirk, two very different armies prepared for confrontation. Edward I's host, though weakened by hunger and long marches, was still a massive war machine. Wallace's Scots, fewer in number and poorly equipped, placed their hopes in discipline, courage, and the strength of their spear formations. Wallace had arranged his army with care. His four great schiltrons, dense circular phalanxes bristling with spears, formed the heart of the defense. These human hedgehogs were designed to repel cavalry, the most feared weapon of the age. The few Scottish archers were placed between the schiltrons, while a small contingent of cavalry guarded the flanks. Edward, surveying the field, immediately saw the challenge. His cavalry could not simply ride down the schiltrons without sustaining terrible losses. But unlike at Stirling Bridge, he had both the numbers and the Welsh longbowmen to break the stalemate. Edward ordered his cavalry forward to probe the Scottish lines. His knights, heavily armoured men-at-arms mounted on powerful destriers, thundered toward the schiltrons. The ground shook with the charge, banners streamed, and the English nobility sought glory in crushing the rebel guardian of Scotland. But Wallace's men stood firm. Spear points gleamed in the morning sun, and the tightly packed circles absorbed the shock. Horses shied away, unwilling to impale themselves on the forest of spears. English knights wheeled and withdrew, frustrated. For a moment, it seemed Wallace's defence might hold, as it had at Stirling. Chroniclers report that the Scottish spearmen cheered as they repelled the first great assault. Edward, however, had learned from past mistakes. Where cavalry alone failed, he would employ his Welsh longbowmen. Ordered forward, they unleashed a storm of arrows that rained down on the tightly packed schiltrons. The Scots had almost no defence. Without large shields or proper armour, men fell in droves. The gaps between formations where Wallace had placed archers quickly became killing zones as the Welsh bowmen outshot and destroyed them. Unlike cavalry, arrows did not need to break the spear wall. They simply fell from the sky, striking men who could not move or disperse without losing their formation. The schiltrons began to bleed. As the Scottish formations wavered under arrow fire, Edward ordered his cavalry forward again. This time, the weakened schiltrons could not hold. Gaps opened, and knights drove their lances and swords into the spear walls. One after another, the Scottish circles were broken. Once inside, the cavalry hacked the packed spearmen apart, turning formations into massacres. The marshy ground offered some resistance, but not enough to stop the relentless English advance. The Scottish cavalry, small in number and already wavering in loyalty, did little to intervene. Many nobles withdrew altogether, abandoning Wallace's infantry to their fate. This betrayal deepened the slaughter. The battle now turned into a rout. The Scottish army disintegrated as men fled the field. English knights pursued mercilessly, cutting down fugitives. Chroniclers speak of thousands slain, their bodies littering the field around Falkirk. Estimates vary, but between 5,000 to 7,000 Scots may have perished that day. Wallace himself escaped, though accounts differ on how. Some suggest he fled once the schiltrons collapsed. Others claim his men shielded his retreat. Whatever the case, his survival meant the war was not yet over, but his reputation as an undefeated leader was shattered. The battlefield was a charnel ground. The once proud schiltrons, hailed as symbols of Scottish resistance, had been ripped apart by the combined force of cavalry and archery. The English had proven that Wallace's tactics, though innovative, could be countered with the right mix of arms. Edward, though triumphant, did not fully capitalize on the victory. His supply lines were stretched and his army, exhausted and hungry, could not press further north into Scotland. Instead, he withdrew, leaving behind garrisons, but not total conquest. For Scotland, the defeat at Falkirk destroyed Wallace's credibility as guardian. He resigned his position later that year, replaced by nobles like Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. Scotland remained in rebellion, but its unity fractured. For England, Edward had reasserted dominance, but at great cost. His inability to follow through showed the limits of even his immense resources. Scotland would remain unconquered for years to come. For warfare, Falkirk is remembered as one of the first battles where the longbow demonstrated its devastating potential. It foreshadowed the great English victories of the 100 Years' War at Crecy and Agincourt. Walter of Guisborough records that the Chilterns stood like a thick wood of spears, but were mowed down by arrows until they could no longer resist. The Lanercost Chronicle describes the Scottish archers being slaughtered like sheep penned in a fold, highlighting the imbalance of missile power. Later Scottish tradition, shaped by national memory, emphasized the bravery of Wallace's men despite betrayal and overwhelming odds. Though a crushing defeat, Falkirk did not end Scotland's struggle. Wallace remained a symbol of defiance, even as his political power waned. In time, leaders like Robert the Bruce would rise, learning from the mistakes of Falkirk to ultimately win independence at Bannockburn. The battle thus stands as both a tragedy and a lesson, a testament to the courage of ordinary Scots and a stark reminder of the brutal realities of medieval warfare. When the dust settled over the fields of Falkirk, the scale of the Scottish disaster became painfully clear. Thousands of men lay dead, their blood soaking the marshy soil. The proud Chilterns that had once given Wallace victory at Stirling had been utterly destroyed, proving vulnerable when faced with the combined power of cavalry and archery. For Edward I, the field was his, but it was a victory that had come at a cost. His men were exhausted, his supply lines stretched thin, and the rugged terrain of Scotland continued to defy permanent occupation. Nevertheless, Falkirk had broken the back of Wallace's army, and the Guardian of Scotland himself was forced into retreat. In the months after Falkirk, William Wallace's aura of invincibility was gone. He had been the architect of Stirling Bridge, the man who humiliated the English and inspired a nation. Now he was the commander who had led thousands to slaughter. By late 1298, Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland, a position he had shared with Andrew Moray before Stirling and held alone after Moray's death. Leadership now shifted to Scotland's nobility, men like Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. This was a pivotal change. The war for independence moved away from charismatic commoner leadership back into the hands of feuding nobles. Wallace did not vanish entirely. He remained a figure of resistance, traveling abroad to seek foreign support and later returning to Scotland. But politically, his time as the central leader of the rebellion was over. The Scottish political situation after Falkirk was chaotic. Divided nobility, the Bruce-Comyn rivalry once again split the resistance. Instead of uniting after the disaster, Scotland's nobles pursued their own ambitions, weakening the war effort. Weakened military, the loss of thousands of trained spearmen crippled Scotland's ability to field large armies in the short term. Recruitment became harder as morale plummeted. Loss of credibility. Abroad, Wallace's mission to Europe after Falkirk, seeking aid from France and the papacy, carried less weight now that his army had been annihilated. Edward I might have hoped Falkirk would end the rebellion once and for all, but the victory proved hollow in the long run. Logistical problems. His army was starving and weary. Supplies had been consumed in the march north, and Scottish scorched earth tactics denied him resources. Edward was forced to retreat south despite his victory. Limited occupation. Though he placed garrisons in key strongholds, he could not subdue the entirety of Scotland. The countryside remained hostile and guerrilla resistance continued. English finances strained. The campaign had been ruinously expensive, fueling discontent back home. Parliament grew weary of endless taxation to fund the Scottish wars. The consequences of Falkirk shaped the next decade of the wars. Rise of Robert the Bruce. Although Bruce was not yet king, Falkirk's aftermath gave him space to maneuver. Wallace's downfall cleared the stage for Bruce's eventual rise. English overconfidence. Edward's belief that he had permanently crushed Scottish resistance led him to underestimate the resilience of the Scots. This mistake would haunt the English later. A turning point in warfare. The dominance of the longbow at Falkirk revealed the future of English military power. The lesson would be repeated at Crecy, 1346, and Agincourt, 1415. After his crushing defeat at Falkirk in 1298, William Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland. His reputation had suffered, but he remained a symbol of resistance. For several years, Wallace operated in the shadows, avoiding major battles, relying on small-scale guerrilla tactics and seeking international allies to keep Scotland's cause alive. By 1299 to 1300, Wallace was believed to have travelled abroad, particularly to France, where he petitioned King Philip IV for aid against England. Some sources also suggest he journeyed to the papal court in Rome, appealing for recognition of Scotland's independence. These efforts, though diplomatically bold, produced little tangible support. By 1303 to 1304, Wallace was back in Scotland. Edward I had launched a massive new invasion, and most of the Scottish nobility had submitted to English rule. Only Wallace refused to yield. His defiance kept him a marked man, England's most wanted rebel. Edward issued repeated orders for Wallace's capture. Bounties were placed on his head, and English officials in Scotland were instructed to hunt him relentlessly. In August 1305, William Wallace was betrayed. The man responsible is traditionally identified as Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who sided with the English crown. Acting as Sheriff of Dumbarton, Menteith captured Wallace near Robroyston, close to Glasgow. Motives of betrayal. Menteith's reasons are debated: ambition, survival, or pressure from Edward. Whatever the cause, he delivered Wallace to the English, sealing the rebel leader's fate. The capture. Wallace was taken by surprise. Armed resistance was impossible, and his small band of followers could not protect him. After capture, Wallace was immediately transported south under heavy guard. His arrival in London was a spectacle. The English authorities wanted to make an example of him. Crowds lined the streets as Wallace was paraded through the city in chains. To Edward I, Wallace was not a soldier but a traitor, despite Wallace never having sworn fealty to the English crown. This legal technicality was ignored. Propaganda mattered more than justice. On the 23rd of August, 1305, William Wallace was put on trial at Westminster Hall. The proceedings were a farce. He had no defence, no jury, and no chance of acquittal. He was charged with treason against Edward I, though Wallace had never accepted Edward as his king, murder and atrocities committed during the rebellion, waging war against the crown, and inciting rebellion. Wallace denied the charge of treason, famously stating, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." His words highlighted the hypocrisy of the trial, but the verdict was predetermined. On the same day, Wallace was sentenced to one of the most brutal executions in medieval England. The English believed Wallace's execution would end resistance. Instead, it made him a martyr. Symbol of defiance, Wallace's refusal to submit and his horrific death turned him into a national hero, remembered for his uncompromising fight for freedom. Robert the Bruce, who would soon emerge as Scotland's leader, inherited the mantle of resistance, partly because Wallace's sacrifice kept the cause alive. Over time, Wallace's life and death were romanticized. Chronicles, poems, and eventually modern works like Braveheart transformed him into a symbol of liberty, not only for Scots but for oppressed peoples everywhere. The betrayal by a fellow Scot adds a tragic dimension to Wallace's story. To this day, Sir John de Menteith is remembered with bitterness in Scottish tradition, while Wallace is revered as a national hero. His capture and execution highlight the brutal realities of medieval power politics. Leaders were expendable, and the line between survival and treachery was thin. But Wallace's name endured long after Menteith's faded into infamy.